I'm going to tell you how my own brother and his wife tried to bury me alive in my own home. They thought 18 months of grief had turned my brain into mush. They thought they could forge my name, steal my life's work, and dump me in a state-run facility like a piece of broken equipment. But here's the thing about people who think they're the smartest in the room. They usually forget to check if the room is recorded. By the time I was done with them, they didn't just lose the money, they lost everything. My name is Jack Miller. I'm 48, and I've spent the better part of 3 decades pouring concrete and framing luxury homes in northern Pennsylvania. My hands are permanently stained with grease and grit, and my back has a permanent ache from carrying this company on my shoulders since I was 20. I built Miller Foundations from a rusted truck into a $12 million empire. 2 years ago, the lights went out. My wife, Sarah, died in a car wreck. She was the one who handled the office, the one who reminded me why I was working so hard. When she died, I checked out. I was a ghost walking around a massive, empty house. That was when my younger brother, Caleb, and his wife, Tiffany, swooped in. Caleb was always the charmer, the one who could talk his way out of a speeding ticket but couldn't hold a job for more than 6 months. Tiffany was younger, sharper, and had eyes that constantly scanned my house like she was already deciding where to put her new furniture. "Jack, you're drowning," Caleb told me one night over a bottle of bourbon. "Let us move in. We'll take care of the house. I'll handle the crews. You just grieve." I was tired. I was lonely. I said yes. It was the biggest mistake of my life. For a year and a half, I let them eat my food, drive my trucks, and spend my money. I saw the investment opportunities Caleb kept bringing me, papers he said were for the business, things he told me Sarah would have wanted. I was so lost in the fog of losing her that I just signed whatever he put in front of me. I thought they were my lifeline. I didn't realize they were the ones holding the anchor that was pulling me under. The wake-up call came from a dead man. Last Thursday, my estate attorney, Mr. Henderson, called me into his office. My father had passed 6 months prior, and Henderson had finally found a hidden safety deposit box key. He led me into the bank vault, a cold, silent place that smelled like old paper and copper. Inside that box wasn't money. It was a digital voice recorder and a stack of bank statements. My father, who had never trusted Caleb a day in his life, had been doing his own investigation before he died. I sat in that gray vault, my hands trembling, and pressed play. My father's raspy voice told me that he'd overheard Caleb talking to a local lawyer, a real bottom feeder named Vance. They were discussing how to liquidate me. Caleb had been forging my signature on massive loans, building a paper trail that made it look like I was gambling away the company's assets. The plan was to prove I had early-onset dementia, get me declared legally incompetent, and take full control of the estate. The betrayal hit me harder than any sledgehammer ever could. My own blood. The brother I'd bailaid out of debt a dozen times. He wasn't just stealing, he was planning to erase me. I didn't storm home. I didn't scream. 20 years of construction teaches you one thing. If you find a crack in the foundation, you don't just patch it. You find out how deep it goes. I called an old friend, Frank. He's an ex-state trooper who runs a high-end surveillance firm. I met him at a greasy diner out by the interstate. I told him I had an infestation in my house. I told him I needed to see everything they did when they thought I was the confused old man. Frank handed me a kit that looked like it belonged to the CIA. Pinhole cameras disguised as screws and smoke detectors. Microphones that could pick up a whisper from across a room. "Jack," Frank said, looking me dead in the eye, "these people are predators. Once you see what they're saying about you, there's no going back. You sure you want to go through this door?" I told him I'd already been through the door. Now, I was just making sure they couldn't find the exit. I went home that night and played the part. I sat at the dinner table, letting my gaze go a little vacant. I let my hands shake as I poured the water. I watched Tiffany watch me. She had this look of pure, satisfied hunger. She asked me if I'd remembered to pay the property taxes. I told her I couldn't quite remember where the bill was. Caleb patted my shoulder, his voice full of fake concern. He told me not to worry, that he and Vance were handling everything for me. That night while they were in the East Wing, I moved through my house like a ghost. I installed the cameras in the kitchen, the living room, and my home office. I worked with the precision I used to use when I was a master carpenter. No mistakes, no visible traces. By 4:00 a.m., the house was wired. I sat in my darkened bedroom and opened the app on my phone. The first thing I heard was Caleb and Tiffany in the kitchen. They didn't know I was listening. Tiffany's voice was sharp, complaining that I was taking too long to break. Caleb laughed, a sound I used to love, but now it made my skin crawl. He told her that Vance had the competency petition ready for next month. He said, once the doctor signs off on the dementia report, Jack will be in a facility in Scranton, and this house will be ours. I sat there in the dark, my heart hammering against my ribs. I looked at the picture of Sarah on my nightstand. I realized that for 2 years, I'd been letting these vultures pick at my bones. I took a deep breath, and for the first time since Sarah died, the fog in my head completely cleared. I wasn't just sad anymore. I was dangerous. The next morning, I walked into the kitchen. I stumbled a little, pretending to be dizzy. I told Caleb I didn't think I could make it to the office today. I saw the predatory joy flash in his eyes before he masked it with worry. He told me to just rest. He said he'd head to the office and take care of things. I thanked him, my voice small and broken. I watched him drive away in my truck, thinking he was the king of the mountain. He had no idea. I had the recordings. I had the bank vault evidence. And I had a plan that was going to make him wish he'd never heard the name Miller. I sat on my porch, phone in hand, watching the live feed of my own office. I was waiting for Vance to arrive. I was waiting for them to make their next mistake. The game was on. They thought they were burying me. They didn't realize I was the one holding the shovel. Watching your own brother plan your funeral while you're still breathing is a special kind of hell. It's a cold, clinical feeling that settles in your gut, like swallowing a handful of rusted nails. I sat there in the shadows of my bedroom, the only light coming from the small screen of my phone, and I watched the man I'd shared a childhood with turn into a total stranger. On the live feed, my office looked the same as always. Oak desk, the framed photos of my best projects, the smell of old blueprints and sawdust that usually brought me peace. But then Vance walked in. He looked exactly like what he was, a $2,500 suit wrapped around a 5-cent sole. He sat down in the chair where my clients usually sit, and he didn't even have the decency to look uncomfortable. I watched Caleb slide a folder across the desk. I heard the rustle of the paper through the hidden microphone, a sound so sharp it made my skin crawl. Caleb told Vance that the signatures were getting better. He said he'd spent the last 3 nights practicing my handwriting until he could mimic my signature on the loan applications without a second thought. Vance just nodded, flipping through the pages, and told him that the bank wouldn't look twice at them as long as the competency assessment was filed by the end of the month. That was the moment I realized just how deep the rot went. Caleb wasn't just stealing the company. He was creating a mountain of debt in my name. If the company went under after they seized it, the creditors would come for me, not them. They were going to leave me broken, and locked in a room where I couldn't tell anyone the truth. I saw Caleb lean back and light a cigar, one of my expensive ones I kept for closing big deals. He told Vance that I was slipping faster than they'd hoped. He laughed and said I'd forgotten where I parked my truck twice this week. He called me a clueless old mule who didn't deserve the empire I'd built. I gripped the edge of my mattress so hard my knuckles turned white. I wanted to drive down there and show him exactly what a clueless mule could do with a framing hammer. But Frank's voice echoed in my head, "Wait for the hole to be deep enough that they can't climb out." I was so focused on the screen that I didn't hear the footsteps in the hallway. The floorboard outside my door groaned, a sound I knew by heart. I barely had time to slide the phone under my pillow and pull the quilt over my chest before the door creaked open. I closed my eyes, forcing my breathing to stay slow and heavy, pretending to be in the middle of a deep, confused sleep. I felt the air in the room shift. Tiffany was standing there. I could smell her perfume, something floral and expensive that didn't belong in a house built on sweat and lumber. I felt her eyes on me, scanning the room. I heard the soft click of her heels as she moved toward my nightstand. I kept my eyes shut, my heart hammering against my ribs so hard I was sure she could see it through the blankets. I heard her pick up Sarah's jewelry box. It was a small, hand-carved piece of cherry wood I'd made for Sarah on our 10th anniversary. Tiffany opened it. I heard the soft clink of the few pieces Sarah had left behind. Then she moved toward the bed. I felt her hand brush the quilt, right near where the phone was hidden. My muscles tensed, ready to spring. If she found that phone, the game was over. I'd have to settle this the old-fashioned way, and that usually ended with someone in the hospital and someone else in a cell. "Jack," she whispered. Her voice was like honey poured over a razor blade. I didn't move. I let out a soft, ragged moan, the kind a man makes when he's lost in a nightmare. I muttered Sarah's name, low and broken. It worked. I heard her let out a small, disgusted huff. She probably thought I was pathetic. She set the jewelry box back down, hard enough that I felt the vibration through the floor, and walked out, closing the door behind her. I lay there in the dark for 10 minutes, sweat cooling on my forehead before I dared to breathe normally. I realized then that playing the fool was the most dangerous job I'd ever taken, but I also realized I needed to speed things up. Their greed was a fire, and if I didn't give it some fuel, they might start looking too closely at the shadows. The next morning, I came down to the kitchen for breakfast. I made sure my flannel shirt was buttoned wrong, and I sat at the table staring at my coffee like I'd never seen a mug before. Tiffany and Caleb were there, acting like the perfect family. Caleb was back from his meetings, telling me how much work he'd done at the office. I waited until they were both looking at me, and then I dropped the lure. I told them I'd had a moment of clarity this morning. I told them I remembered something Sarah had said right before she died. I lowered my voice, making sure I sounded conspiratorial and slightly out of it. I told them Sarah had been worried about the banks failing, so she'd hidden a safety net. I said she'd put $500,000 in cash in a black fireproof box and hidden it somewhere on the property. The silence that hit that kitchen was so thick you could have cut it with a saw. Caleb's fork stopped halfway to his mouth. Tiffany's eyes widened, that predatory hunger I'd seen before flashing like a neon sign. $500,000 in cash?" Caleb asked, trying and failing to keep the excitement out of his voice. "Where, Jack? Where did she put it?" I rubbed my forehead, looking distressed. I told him I couldn't quite remember. I said I thought it was somewhere in the foundation of one of the outbuildings, or maybe buried near the old oak tree. I told them my head was too foggy to be sure, but I knew the box was there. I said I was worried because I couldn't find the key. I watched the wheels turning in their heads. They didn't just want the company anymore. They wanted the easy cash, and they wanted it now. Caleb told me not to worry about it. He said I should just go take a walk in the woods and clear my head, while he and Tiffany did some maintenance around the property. I thanked him, acting like a man who just had a heavy weight lifted off his shoulders. I put on my coat and walked out the back door, heading toward the tree line. But I didn't go far. I circled back to the old tool shed, where I had a clear view of the house and my phone in my hand. The cameras picked them up almost immediately. They didn't even wait for my truck to get out of sight. Caleb and Tiffany were in the mudroom, grabbing shovels and a crowbar. Caleb was shouting at her, telling her that if they found that cash, they wouldn't even need Vance anymore. He said they could take the $500,000 and disappear before the competency hearing even started. Tiffany was even worse. She was already talking about a villa in Cabo. She said she was tired of playing nursemaid to a mental patient, and that she hoped the stress of losing the cash would finally finish me off. I watched my brother, a man who shared my last name, head toward the barn with a crowbar in his hand, ready to tear up the floors of the building I'd spent 2 years of my life restoring. He looked like a grave robber. I sat there in the cold dampness of the shed, watching the people I'd trusted try to dismantle my life. My finger hovered over the record button on the app. I was capturing every word, every shovel thrust, every greedy snarl. But then the feed on my office camera flickered. Vance was back, but he wasn't alone. He had a man with him I didn't recognize, a guy in a white lab coat with a stethoscope around his neck. I realized then that they weren't waiting for next month. They were bringing the assessment to me today. And if they found me hiding in a shed, spying on my own family with high-tech gear, I wouldn't be the hunter anymore. I'd be the prey. I had to get back into that house. I had to be the confused old man again, and I had to do it before they realized the box of cash didn't exist. I started to move, but then I heard a voice right behind me. "Looking for something, Jack?" I spun around. It was Tiffany. She hadn't gone to the barn with Caleb. She stayed behind, and she was looking at the phone in my hand with eyes that were as cold as a Pennsylvania winter. The air in the tool shed felt like it had been sucked out by a vacuum. Tiffany was standing in the doorway, her silhouette blocking the gray morning light. Her eyes weren't on me. They were locked onto the glowing screen of the phone in my hand. For a second, the mask of the grieving builder almost slipped. My fingers tightened around the phone, and every instinct I'd honed on rough job sites screamed at me to shut her down right there. But I forced my pulse to slow. I let my shoulders slump. I made my bottom lip tremble just a fraction. I looked at the phone, then back at her, and I let out a soft, whimpering sound. I told her I was just trying to call Sarah. I told her the phone was broken because Sarah wasn't picking up. I started pressing random buttons on the screen, acting like a frustrated child with a toy he didn't understand. The suspicion in Tiffany's eyes didn't vanish, but it shifted. She took a step toward me, her heels clicking on the dirt floor of the shed. She reached out and snatched the phone from my hand. I let her take it. I watched her thumb through the screen. Fortunately, Frank's software was invisible. To her, it just looked like a locked phone with a picture of Sarah as the wallpaper. She let out a sharp, disgusted breath and shoved the phone into her coat pocket. She told me Sarah was gone and that I needed to stop living in the past. Then she grabbed my arm, her grip surprisingly strong, and told me we had guests. She led me back toward the house like I was a stray dog. As we crossed the yard, I saw Caleb coming from the barn. He was covered in mud, his face red with frustration and sweat. He'd clearly been ripping up floorboards looking for that non-existent 500 grand. When he saw me, he glared, his eyes full of a new kind of resentment. He didn't say a word, just followed us inside. Vance was waiting in the great room, sitting on my leather sofa like he owned the place. Beside him was a man who looked like he'd been pulled from a bargain bin medical drama. He had a cheap white coat and a stethoscope that looked like it had never touched a human chest. Vance introduced him as Dr. Aris. He said they were just there for a routine wellness check, to make sure the stress wasn't getting to me. I sat in my armchair, Sarah's favorite chair, and felt the vultures circling. Dr. Aris started asking me questions, simple things at first. What's the date? Who's the governor? Where do you keep your important papers, Jack? I played the part perfectly. I got the date wrong by a decade. I told him the governor was a man who'd been dead since the 90s. Every time I failed, I saw Vance make a small note on a legal pad. But I wasn't just sitting there taking it. I was observing. I noticed the way Dr. Aris kept glancing at the mud on Caleb's boots. I noticed the way Tiffany was hovering near the kitchen, her eyes darting between Caleb and the lawyer. The greed in that room was a living, breathing thing. I decided it was time to turn the screw. I leaned forward, looking at the doctor with a sudden, wide-eyed intensity. I lowered my voice to a conspiratorial whisper, making sure Caleb and Vance could hear me. I told the doctor that I knew why they were really here. I told him they wanted the black box. Caleb froze. Vance's pen stopped moving. I told the doctor that I'd remembered where the key was. I looked directly at Tiffany and said I'd given it to her for safekeeping months ago. I said, "Remember, Tiffany, the little silver key with the blue ribbon. You told me you put it in your jewelry box so I wouldn't lose it." Tiffany's face went from pale to ghostly white. She started stammering, telling everyone I was hallucinating. But I saw the look Caleb gave her. It was a look of pure, unadulterated suspicion. He'd spent the morning digging in the mud while I was telling him his wife already had the key to the fortune. Vance cleared his throat, his eyes narrowing. He asked Tiffany if she had anything she wanted to share with the group. She screamed at him to shut up. She told them I was just a crazy old man trying to stir up trouble. I sat back, letting a vacant smile drift across my face. The seeds were planted. Dr. Aris stood up a few minutes later. He told Vance that the cognitive decline was evident and that he'd have the preliminary report signed by evening. He looked at me with a pity that made me want to break his jaw, then headed for the door. Vance followed him out, but not before leaning in and whispering something to Caleb. I couldn't hear it, but I didn't need to. I knew the plan. The petition would be filed in 48 hours. They were moving for an emergency guardianship. Once the guests were gone, the house became a war zone. Caleb grabbed Tiffany by the arm and dragged her into the kitchen. I stayed in my chair, but I reached into my pocket and pulled out my backup device, a small tablet Frank had given me that mirrored the house's audio. I put on my earbuds and listened. The fight was brutal. Caleb was shouting, asking her where the hell the key was. He accused her of trying to cut him out of the cash side of the deal. He told her he knew she'd been talking to her ex-boyfriend in Philly. He said if she was hiding that $500,000, he'd make sure she ended up with nothing. Tiffany was hysterical. She was swearing on her life that I was lying. She told him I was playing them, but Caleb didn't believe her. Why would he? He'd seen me decline for months. In his mind, I wasn't smart enough to lie. "Vance is right," Caleb growled. I could hear the sound of a chair being shoved across the floor. "We can't wait for the state facility. Once the papers are signed tomorrow, we move him to the private ward Vance set up. It's a lockdown basement in a clinic out in the sticks. No visitors, no lawyers, just Jack and a heavy dose of sedatives until we find that box." My blood turned to liquid nitrogen. A private ward. That was code for a place where people go to disappear. They weren't just stealing the company anymore. They were planning a kidnapping. I realized then that my long con was running out of time. I had the recordings of them planning the fraud. I had the bank documents, but I needed Vance. I needed the lawyer to incriminate himself in a way that left no room for a plea deal. I stood up, my joints popping, and walked toward the kitchen. I made sure to stumble, hitting the doorframe with my shoulder. They both stopped shouting and looked at me. I looked at Caleb, my eyes watery and wide. I told him I'd remembered something else. I told him the $500,000 wasn't in a box. I said I'd invested it in a private account that only Vance had the password for. I said, "Vance told me not to tell you, Caleb. He said you weren't ready for that kind of responsibility." The look on Caleb's face wasn't just anger anymore. It was a total, scorched-earth betrayal. He looked at the kitchen phone, then at his car keys. "I'm going to go see Vance," Caleb said, his voice trembling with rage. "Stay here with the mule, Tiffany, and don't you dare let him out of your sight." He slammed the door so hard the windows rattled. I watched through the kitchen window as my brother sped down the driveway, heading straight for the man who was supposed to be his partner in crime. Tiffany turned to me, her face a mask of pure hatred. She walked over to the counter and picked up a heavy rolling pin. She told me she was tired of my clarity. She said she was going to make sure I stayed foggy until Caleb got back. I looked at her, and for the first time in 18 months, I stopped playing the fool. I stood up straight. I rolled my shoulders back. I looked her dead in the eye with the same cold intensity I used when a subcontractor tried to shortchange me on a job. "Tiffany," I said, my voice deep and steady, "you might want to put that down, because the police are currently listening to every word you've said for the last 6 hours." The rolling pin slipped from her hand and hit the floor with a dull thud. The look on Tiffany's face was worth every second of the last 18 months. It wasn't just fear. It was the total, systemic collapse of her reality. She stared at me, her mouth hanging open, looking at the man she'd called a clueless mule just an hour ago. I didn't look like a confused widower anymore. I looked like the man who'd built a $12 million empire with nothing but grit and a framing hammer. I told her to sit down. I didn't yell. I didn't have to. My voice had that low, gravelly authority that usually makes a job site go silent. She sank into the kitchen chair, her hands shaking so hard they looked like they were vibrating. I reached into my pocket, pulled out my phone, and tapped a command. The hidden speakers in the kitchen, tiny things Frank had tucked into the recessed lighting, started playing back the conversation she'd had with Caleb 10 minutes ago. Hearing her own voice talk about finishing me off and moving me to a private ward seemed to break something in her. She started to sob, but there was no heart in it. It was just the sound of a cornered animal realizing the cage door was locked from the outside. I ignored her. I had other things to monitor. I opened the live feed from the camera Frank had planted in Vance's office. Caleb had just burst in. On the small screen, I watched my brother, red-faced, mud-stained and vibrating with paranoid rage, slam his fists onto Vance's mahogany desk. He was screaming about the $500,000. He accused Vance of cutting a side deal with me, of hiding the black box cash, of planning to screw him over once the guardianship was finalized. Vance looked like he'd been hit with a bucket of ice water. He kept trying to calm Caleb down, telling him there was no cash, that I was just a senile old man making things up. But the seed I'd planted was too deep. Caleb had seen me decline for a year. He couldn't wrap his head around the idea that I was capable of a sophisticated lie. He thought Vance was the one lying. Then Caleb said the words that changed everything. "I didn't kill Sarah for peanuts, Vance," Caleb roared, his voice distorted by the tiny microphone. "I did the dirty work. I was the one who called those collectors in Philly and told them she was the one holding the ledger. I made sure she was on that road that night. You told me if she was gone, Jack would break and we'd have it all. Now you're hiding the cash." The kitchen went so quiet I could hear the hum of the refrigerator. Tiffany's sobbing stopped. She looked at me, her eyes wide with a new kind of terror. I felt the world tilt on its axis. I'd known they were greedy. I'd known they were frauds, but I'd believed Sarah's death was a tragedy, a freak accident on a snowy highway. Hearing my brother admit to orchestrating the circumstances that put her in that grave, it didn't just break my heart. It turned whatever was left of my soul into a slab of cold, hard granite. Caleb hadn't pulled the trigger, but he'd pointed the gun. He knew about the gambling debt Sarah had discovered on his laptop. He knew she was going to tell me. So he'd leaked her location to the very people he owed money to, knowing they'd run her off the road to get his attention. On the screen, Vance finally realized Caleb was a liability. He stood up, his face ashen, and told Caleb to get out. He said the competency project was canceled. He said Caleb was a loose cannon and a murderer. I didn't wait to hear the rest. I picked up my phone and called Frank. I told him the game was over. I told him I had the confession. "I'm 3 minutes out, Jack," Frank said, his voice steady and cold. "The sheriff is right behind me. We've been recording the office feed since Caleb walked in. It's over." I hung up and looked at Tiffany. She was trying to crawl toward the back door. I didn't even move to stop her. I just told her that the house was surrounded and that there was nowhere left to run. She collapsed on the floor, burying her face in her hands, muttering that she didn't know about Sarah, that she only wanted the money. I walked out onto the porch. The Pennsylvania hills were covered in a light mist, the same kind of mist that had been on the road the night Sarah died. I stood there, breathing in the cold air, feeling the weight of 18 months of grief finally being replaced by something else. It wasn't happiness. It was justice. The siren started low, a distant wail coming up the valley road. Within minutes, the gravel driveway was flooded with blue and red lights. Frank pulled in first, jumping out of his SUV with a tablet in his hand. He looked at me, saw the look in my eyes, and just nodded. "We got them, Jack," he said. "The sheriff's deputies are at Vance's office now. Caleb and Vance are being taken into custody for conspiracy, fraud, and now, accessory to murder." The deputies moved past me into the house to pick up Tiffany. As they led her out in handcuffs, she tried to look at me, tried to say something, but I turned my back. She was nothing to me now, just debris to be cleared from the site. I spent the next 4 hours at the station. I sat in a cold room with a detective and played the recordings. I showed them the bank vault documents my father had left me. I showed them the forged signatures Caleb had practiced. But mostly, we listened to that 1 minute of audio from Vance's office, the minute where my brother admitted to killing my wife. The detective told me that with Caleb's confession and the evidence of the debts, they had enough to reopen the case into Sarah's accident. They were already tracing the calls Caleb had made to the collectors in Philly. When I finally walked out of the station, it was dark. The air was crisp, smelling of wood smoke and winter. Frank was waiting for me by my truck. He asked me if I was okay. I told him I was tired. I told him I had a lot of work to do. "What are you going to do about the house?" Frank asked. "The company." I looked out at the lights of the town. I told him I was going to tear down the east wing of the house, the part where they'd lived. I told him I was going to rebuild it into something Sarah would have liked. A library, maybe, or a sunroom. But first, I had one more thing to do. I drove back to the house, but I didn't go inside. I went to the barn, the one Caleb had been tearing up looking for the black box. I walked to the corner, near the old oak workbench, and reached under the floorboards in a spot Caleb had missed. I pulled out a small metal box. There was no $500,000 in it. I'd lied about that to trigger their greed. But there was something in there. It was Sarah's real ledger, the one she'd been keeping on Caleb's thefts before she died. She'd hidden it there for me to find, knowing that if she didn't make it home, I'd eventually need the tools to finish the job. I sat on the dirt floor of the barn and held that ledger to my chest. I realized then that I'd never been alone. Even when I was the fool, Sarah had been there, holding the foundation steady from the other side. I looked at the house, the red and blue lights still reflecting in the windows from the lingering cruisers. The vultures were gone. The snakes were in cages. But as I stood up, I felt a strange vibration in my pocket. It was my phone, a new notification from the office camera. Someone was in my office. Someone who wasn't Caleb, wasn't Vance, and wasn't the police. I opened the feed and my heart stopped. Standing in my office, looking directly into the hidden camera with a cold, knowing smile, was a man I hadn't seen in 20 years. A man I thought was dead. My father. I didn't call the police. I didn't call Frank. I drove to that office like a man possessed, my knuckles white on the steering wheel, my mind a storm of static and fire. My father, Samuel Miller, had been buried 6 months ago. I'd stood at the grave. I'd felt the weight of the dirt on his casket. I'd watched the light leave his eyes in that hospital room. But when I kicked open the door to my office, there he was. He was sitting in my chair, looking thinner, his skin like parchment, but those steel-gray eyes were as sharp as ever. He wasn't wearing a hospital gown or a shroud. He was wearing his old work jacket, the one that smelled like pine and tobacco. I stood in the doorway, my chest heaving, the digital ledger from the barn still clutched in my hand. I asked him how. I asked him why. My voice sounded like it was coming from the bottom of a deep well. He didn't move. He just looked at me with a tired kind of pride. He told me that the emphysema was real, but the end was a stage-managed performance. He'd known Caleb was a snake since the day he was born. He'd seen Caleb and Vance whispering in the corners of his house while he was dying. He knew that if he stayed alive, Caleb would just keep playing the long game, waiting for the old man to wither. "I had to go into the shadows, Jack," he said, his voice a raspy ghost of the one I remembered. "Caleb was too smart to slip up while I was watching, but he wasn't smart enough to hide from a dead man. He'd used a doctor he trusted to help him pass and slip away to a cabin in the Poconos. He'd been the one feeding Frank information. He'd been the one who made sure Henderson called me about the safety deposit box on the exact day I was most vulnerable. He'd been the architect of the entire countertrap. I wanted to be angry. I wanted to scream at him for the 6 months of mourning, for the extra weight of grief I'd carried on top of Sarah's death. But as I looked at him, I realized he'd spent his last few months of life living in a shack, breathing through an oxygen tank, all to make sure I didn't end up in a hole in the ground. "The foundation was rotten, Jack," he said, echoing my own thoughts from weeks ago. "I couldn't fix it while I was standing in the house. I had to let it burn so you could see the ruins." We sat there in the dark office for an hour. He told me everything, how he'd tracked Caleb's gambling debts, how he'd seen the forged signatures. But then I told him the one thing he didn't know. I told him about Caleb's confession. I told him Sarah wasn't just a casualty of bad luck. The old man's face went stone cold. He'd known Caleb was a thief, but he hadn't known he was a murderer. For a moment, the steel-gray eyes went wet, and he looked every bit of his 80 years. We didn't talk after that. We just sat there, two men built from concrete and lumber, watching the sun start to peek over the Pennsylvania horizon. The trial was a slaughter. The prosecution didn't even have to work for it. Between my surveillance footage, the safety deposit box recordings, the forged documents, and Sarah's hidden ledger, the evidence was an absolute mountain. Vance went first. He tried to claim he was coerced by Caleb, but Frank's microphones had captured him laughing about the competency project too many times. He was disbarred within a week and sentenced to 25 years for fraud, conspiracy, and racketeering. He looked like a shriveled grape in his orange jumpsuit, all the expensive silk replaced by cheap cotton. Tiffany took a plea. She flipped on Caleb in exchange for 10 years. She cried on the stand, telling the jury she was just a girl who got caught up in a bad man's web. The jury didn't buy it. They saw the footage of her looking at me like a piece of meat. Then came Caleb. My brother didn't look at me once during the entire 3-week trial. He sat at the defense table, his head down, looking like the small, bitter boy he'd always been. When the audio of his confession was played, the part where he admitted to orchestrating Sarah's death, the entire courtroom went silent. Even his own lawyer looked like he wanted to vomit. The judge didn't hold back. She called him a stain on the soul of the Commonwealth. She sentenced him to life without the possibility of parole for accessory to murder, plus another 40 years for the financial crimes. As they led him away, Caleb finally looked up. He looked at me, then his eyes shifted to the back of the courtroom. My father was sitting there, his face half hidden by a hat and a scarf. Caleb's eyes went wide. He looked like he'd seen a ghost, because in a way he had. Caleb started screaming, shouting that it wasn't fair, that the old man had cheated. The bailiffs dragged him out, his voice echoing through the marble halls until the heavy doors slammed shut. That was the last time I ever saw my brother. The aftermath was a long, slow process of clearing the site. I sold the business. I couldn't walk into the yard without seeing the trucks Caleb had driven. I couldn't look at the crews without wondering who else had been in on it. I took the $12 million and I made sure every person Sarah had ever cared about was taken care of. I kept the house. I kept my promise to Sarah. I hired a crew of guys I'd known for years, men who'd worked for my father, and we tore down the east wing. We leveled it to the dirt. Then we rebuilt. No luxury suites, no guest wings for vultures. We built a sunroom with floor-to-ceiling glass that looked out over the valley Sarah loved. We built a library with shelves made of cherry wood from the barn. My father lived just long enough to see it finished. He passed away for real this time, 3 months after the trial. He died in that sunroom, watching the leaves turn gold on the mountains. This time, I didn't mourn like a man in a fog. I mourned like a man who'd been given a second chance. I'm 50 now. I'm alone in this house, but for the first time in years, I'm not lonely. I have my dog, a new golden retriever named Frank after the man who helped me save my life. I spend my days working in the barn, not building empires, but building furniture. Small things, solid things. People in town still talk. They call me the man who played the fool. They tell the story of the contractor who wired his own house to catch a killer. I don't mind. Let them talk. Every night I sit in that sunroom and I have a bourbon. I look at the picture of Sarah on the mantle. The frame isn't cracked anymore. I fixed it. I've learned a lot about foundations in 48 years. I've learned that you can pour the strongest concrete in the world. You can use the best lumber and the sharpest nails. But if the people inside the house are rotten, the whole thing is coming down. But I also learned that you can rebuild. You can take the ruins, the betrayal, and the grief, and you can use them to build something even stronger. You just have to be willing to hold the shovel. The snakes are gone. The vultures have starved. And for the first time in a very long time, the foundation of my life is solid. I took a deep breath, looked out at the quiet Pennsylvania hills, and for the first time in 20 years, I didn't think about the next opportunity. I just appreciated the view.